On December 20th, 1983, just days before Christmas, 22-year-old Erin Gilmore was found dead in her apartment in Toronto. Gilmore, the daughter of businessman David Gilmore, lived in an upscale neighborhood and was known for her vibrant personality. Her boyfriend, Andrew Monk, arrived at her apartment to pick her up for dinner and noticed the front door was ajar. When he entered the residence, he discovered her lifeless body in the bedroom, in a state of panic. Monk called 911 and, in shock, initially reported that she may have taken her own life. Once authorities arrived at the scene, it quickly became evident that Erin Gilmore had been the victim of a violent crime. She had been bound and gagged, then stabbed multiple times in both the front and back. Detective Stephen Smith of the Toronto Police later confirmed that investigators believed she had been sexually assaulted. Following a thorough investigation, Monk was ruled out as a suspect after ATM records placed him in another location at the time of the murder. Just 4 months earlier and 2 miles away, 45-year-old Susan Tice was also found murdered in her home. She had been stabbed to death in her bed and, like Gilmore, had been sexually assaulted. Tice was a mother of 4 and a therapist, and at the time of her death, she was going through a contentious divorce. Her brother-in-law discovered her body after she failed to show up for a scheduled family dinner. Initially, her estranged husband was investigated but was later cleared. Despite media attention and extensive investigative efforts, neither murder resulted in an arrest. No suspect was identified at the time, and both cases eventually went cold. For the families of Erin Gilmore and Susan Tice, the pain of their murders did not end with the initial investigations. Instead, it lingered for decades, deepened by the absence of answers. Sean McCowan, Erin's brother, has spoken about the enduring trauma that began in 1983 and shadowed his life for 40 years. Her death left what he described as a permanent hole in their family, an absence that could never be repaired. The lack of justice added a weight that only grew heavier with time. Susan Tice's son, Ben Tice, also carried the burden of unanswered questions. He remembered his mother as a powerful, independent woman, a therapist navigating a painful divorce while asserting her autonomy. Ben described her as a force of nature, someone determined to live on her own terms. The impact of her murder was compounded by the initial scrutiny placed on his father, who became a person of interest during the early investigation. Although his father was eventually cleared, the suspicion cast a shadow over their grieving process. As the years passed, the families were left to endure their sorrow in silence. Despite national media coverage, repeated efforts by detectives, and public interest in the cases, no suspect emerged. The enduring mystery left both families trapped in a cycle of loss without resolution. With no one held accountable and no answers to ease their grief, they continue to live in the long shadow cast by 2 violent, unsolved crimes. In the year 2000, a major breakthrough in forensic science marked a turning point in the investigation. Advances in DNA analysis allowed authorities to revisit the evidence from both crime scenes. Through this technology, the Toronto police confirmed that the same unknown individual was responsible for the murders of Erin Gilmore and Susan Tice. This scientific confirmation validated long-held suspicions that the 2 brutal crimes were connected. Despite this progress, the DNA profile did not lead to a suspect. While investigators had conclusive proof that the 2 cases were linked, they lacked the ability to identify the person behind the profile. At the time, the National DNA Database did not contain the unknown assailant's genetic information, and there was no immediate way to trace it back to a name. With renewed focus, detectives re-examined both cases, looking for patterns that might connect the victims beyond the manner of their deaths. Gilmore and Tice had lived just 2 miles apart, and both were sexually assaulted and stabbed in their homes. However, investigators found no known personal or social link between the 2 women during their lives. The absence of such a connection made the case more challenging. Although the DNA link provided clarity about the crimes being the work of a single perpetrator, it also highlighted the limitations of existing investigative tools. The revelation set the stage for future developments in forensic science, most notably genetic genealogy, that would eventually push the case forward after nearly 2 decades of dormancy. By 2018, investigative genetic genealogy had proven itself as a powerful tool for solving cold cases. The successful identification of California's Golden State Killer using public DNA databases prompted law enforcement agencies around the world to explore similar methods. Motivated by this breakthrough, Toronto authorities enlisted the help of Othram Labs, a forensic lab based in Texas, to apply the same approach to the Gilmore and Tice investigations. Othram's team developed a viable DNA profile from the crime scene evidence. However, they encountered a significant obstacle. The suspect's DNA had characteristics commonly found in individuals with First Nations heritage. This created difficulties because people from First Nations communities were significantly underrepresented in public genealogy databases. Additionally, the genetic homogeneity of the population posed further challenges in distinguishing between individuals. Despite these limitations, Toronto Police's in-house genealogist, James Atkinson, methodically worked through the available data. Through careful analysis, he was able to narrow the DNA source to one specific family with 5 brothers. Investigators began eliminating each brother as a possible match, eventually focusing on Joseph George Sutherland. Sutherland had lived in Toronto at the time of the 1983 murders, but had since relocated to Moosonee, a remote town in northern Ontario. In November 2022, detectives traveled to his residence with a warrant. They encountered Sutherland, who was 60 years old at the time, and described him as calm and polite. He voluntarily accompanied them to a nearby precinct and submitted a DNA sample without resistance. This pivotal development marked the first time in nearly 40 years that investigators had a viable suspect. It was a result of combining cutting-edge forensic science with persistent and methodical detective work. The identification of Sutherland illustrated how technology, when guided by expertise and determination, can bring resolution to even the longest-standing unsolved crimes. Just one day after handing over his DNA sample to Toronto police, Joseph George Sutherland made a confession that no one saw coming, least of all his closest friend. Randy Coda, a retired police officer, had known Sutherland for decades. The two men shared a quiet camaraderie in the remote town of Moosonee, bonding over long days snowmobiling, hunting, and trapping in the northern wilderness. Sutherland, now 60, had always come across as mild-mannered and thoughtful, a man who kept himself but was always dependable. So when he asked to speak with Coda in private, the last thing his friend expected was a revelation that would shatter years of trust. In a voice heavy with emotion, Sutherland admitted that he had done something terrible in his youth. He explained that in 1983, while burglarizing homes in Toronto, he had been confronted by the women who lived there. In a panic, he had sexually assaulted and then stabbed both of them to death. Sutherland described the crimes not with cold detachment, but with a trembling sense of remorse. He said the memories had haunted him for decades, nightmares he could not shake, guilt that never let go. Coda was stunned. The man he thought he knew was now revealing a past stained with brutal violence. Before leaving to take his grandchildren to the train, Coda urged Sutherland not to run. Then, fulfilling his duty, he alerted former law enforcement colleagues about the confession and helped arrange for Sutherland's peaceful surrender. When Coda returned, he spoke directly and firmly. "You lived free for 40 years. Those women's families never got that luxury." Sutherland nodded, defeated. That same night, he walked into the police station and gave himself up. It was a confession born not from pressure, but from shame and the conscience of a man who had spent a lifetime in hiding, only to be brought to justice by friendship and truth. Nearly 40 years after the brutal murders of Aaron Gilmore and Susan Tice, justice finally caught up with Joseph George Sutherland. In 2023, Sutherland pled guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. During sentencing, the courtroom was silent as he was handed a life sentence, with the possibility of parole after 21 years. For the families of the victims, the decision brought a long-awaited sense of closure, though the wounds left behind could never fully heal. For Sean McCowan, Aaron Gilmore's half-brother, the moment the news broke was overwhelming. He described collapsing in tears, his body trembling as for decades of grief, frustration, and unanswered questions suddenly gave way to relief and release. The pain of losing Aaron had never dulled, but knowing the man responsible would finally face consequences brought a measure of peace. Sutherland's confession, combined with the powerful genetic evidence, left no room for doubt. His acknowledgement of guilt, decades after the crimes, reinforced what investigators had worked tirelessly to prove, that science and perseverance could succeed where time had once failed. Though justice had taken far too long, it had not been denied. Two of Toronto's most haunting cold cases were no longer unsolved mysteries. They were now resolved crimes with a name, a face, and a sentence. Justice may have taken nearly 4 decades, but in the end, it arrived, carried on the shoulders of science, perseverance, and the undying love of families who never stopped fighting for answers. Aaron Gilmore and Susan Tice were not forgotten. Their stories were not buried in time, and their names will now forever be linked with a hard-earned justice that refused to be silenced. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share this video. And let us know in the comments. Do you believe justice delayed is still justice served? Thank you for watching. On December 24th, 2007, in a rural area near Carnation, Washington, a brutal mass killing unfolded inside the home of Wayne and Judy Anderson. Their property sat quietly about 40 kilometers east of Seattle, tucked away in a peaceful and remote community. What was meant to be a family gathering on Christmas Eve turned into a crime scene that would shock the entire nation. 6 members of the Anderson family were murdered that afternoon. 60-year-old Wayne Scott Anderson, a Boeing engineer, and his wife Judy Anderson, age 61, who worked for the Postal Service, were the first victims. Their son, Scott Anderson, age 32, was also killed, along with his wife, Erica Mantle Anderson, also 32. Their 2 young children, 5-year-old Olivia and 3-year-old Nathan, were the last to be executed. The killers were members of the family. Michelle Kristen Anderson, the 29-year-old daughter of Wayne and Judy, was one of the 2 individuals responsible. Alongside her was her boyfriend, Joseph Thomas McEnroe. Together, they carried out a carefully planned and methodical murder of 6 people across 3 generations. Michelle Anderson later claimed that her motive stemmed from years of perceived mistreatment by her family. She stated that her parents had failed to support her emotionally and financially. Her main grievance centered around a belief that her older brother, Scott, owed her money, and that the family had consistently sided with him over her. These resentments, according to her own confession, had built up over time, leading her to conclude that she had been treated unfairly and pushed aside. Rather than walk away from the situation or seek legal resolution, Michelle chose revenge. With McEnroe's full cooperation, the couple devised a plan to eliminate the entire family. The act was not spontaneous or chaotic. It was deliberate and staged with precision. They selected Christmas Eve knowing the entire family would gather at the Anderson home. They used that moment of togetherness not to celebrate, but to execute. What followed was a sequence of killings that wiped out the entire immediate family. The home, decorated for the holiday season, became the site of a cold-blooded massacre. There were no survivors. The motive, as described by Michelle, was rooted not in desperation, but in a desire to punish those she believed had ignored, mistreated, and forgotten her. The events that began that afternoon would mark one of Washington State's most horrifying family murders in recent history. On the afternoon of December 24th, 2007, Michelle Anderson and her boyfriend, Joseph Thomas McEnroe, drove their pickup truck toward the home of her parents, Wayne and Judy Anderson. The house stood in a quiet, wooded area near Carnation, Washington, surrounded by trees and rural stillness. It was Christmas Eve, and the Anderson family was preparing for the holiday, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. Judy Anderson was inside the house wrapping Christmas presents when the couple arrived. The front door opened without resistance. This was family. Michelle and Joseph entered calmly. The atmosphere inside was peaceful, festive, and ordinary. That calm would not last long. Once inside, McEnroe distracted Judy, while Michelle attempted to shoot her father, Wayne. But her rifle jammed. In that moment, the plan threatened to fall apart. McEnroe took control. He raised his own weapon and shot Wayne, killing him. He then turned to Judy and shot her as well. Within minutes, both parents were dead. The couple had committed the first phase of their plan with ruthless precision. After the killings, Michelle and McEnroe dragged the bodies of Wayne and Judy outside. They attempted to clean the interior of the house, removing blood and any potential evidence. They wiped down surfaces and restored a sense of normalcy to the living space. The goal was to conceal what had already happened and prepare for what would come next. Michelle and McEnroe then waited in silence for the rest of the family to arrive. They knew Scott Anderson, Michelle's older brother, was expected for a holiday gathering along with his wife, Erica, and their 2 young children. The couple stayed inside the house, calmly waiting for the next phase of their plan to begin. Sometime later, Scott, Erica, Olivia, and Nathan arrived at the Anderson home. They entered with no knowledge of the murders that had taken place only hours earlier. There was no sign of alarm, no indication that anything was wrong. As they walked into the house, Michelle and McEnroe prepared to strike again. The calculated nature of the attack was evident. Michelle and McEnroe had arranged every step to avoid suspicion, to maintain control, and to eliminate every member of the family. They had taken time to hide the first crime, then calmly waited for more victims to arrive. What began as a holiday visit quickly turned into a trap. The arrival of Scott and his family marked the second, more devastating phase of the plan. The house that had once been filled with warmth and tradition became the scene of a meticulously staged massacre. No member of the family would be spared. The killers showed no hesitation. Their actions that day were methodical, cold, and deliberate. The second round of killings was about to begin, just as the holiday gathering they had planned to destroy came to life. Scott Anderson arrived at his parent home with his wife, Erica Mantle Anderson, and their 2 young children, 5-year-old Olivia and 3-year-old Nathan. It was Christmas Eve, and the family was expected. The house appeared calm. Nothing outside suggested the terror that had already taken place. Inside, Michelle Anderson and Joseph McEnroe stood ready. They had killed Wayne and Judy, cleaned up the scene, and prepared for this moment. As Scott entered, Michelle raised her weapon and shot her brother. The gunshot echoed through the home. Scott was killed instantly. The attack stunned Erica, but she had only seconds to react. Michelle turned the gun on her, firing again. Erica was hit, but she was not immediately killed. Wounded and desperate, Erica reached for the cordless phone inside the house. She managed to dial 911. It was a short, frantic effort. On the other end of the line, emergency dispatchers picked up the call. For a brief moment, they heard muffled sounds, what they later described as arguing or noises from a party. It was difficult to determine what was happening. Before Erica could say anything clearly, Joseph McEnroe intervened. McEnroe grabbed the phone from Erica. He smashed the receiver to the floor and pulled out the battery, cutting the connection. The brief call could have exposed everything, but it ended too quickly for dispatchers to act with urgency. Michelle, realizing the danger of that call, immediately rushed outside and locked the property's gate. It was a calculated move. She knew that if police arrived and found the gate shut, they might not investigate further. That decision delayed discovery of the murders. Inside the house, the killings were not over. Olivia Anderson, only 5 years old, was still alive. McEnroe turned to her. He raised his gun and shot her at extremely close range. She died instantly. There was no struggle, no attempt to flee. It was a cold, calculated execution. The final victim was Nathan Anderson. The 3-year-old had picked up the batteries from a broken phone and held them in his tiny hands. McEnroe approached him. Without hesitation, he shot the child in the head. Nathan died at the scene. The children had posed no physical threat. They had witnessed violence, but they were too young to fully comprehend what had happened. Michelle Anderson would later say that she did not want any witnesses. She claimed the children would be traumatized for life if they were allowed to live. That belief became her justification for the final killings. The deliberate nature of the crime was undeniable. Each action was part of a premeditated plan to eliminate every member of Michelle's immediate family. The murders were not spontaneous or fueled by sudden rage. They were cold and precise. Michelle and McEnroe had prepared for every moment. From the initial arrival to the final execution, they remained in control. By the end of the night, 6 lives had been extinguished. 3 generations of the Anderson family were gone. The home was quiet again, but not with peace. It was silent because no one was left alive. When Erica Anderson, wounded and desperate, managed to dial 911, It triggered the only outside alert during the massacre. On the other end, emergency dispatchers answered, but what they heard offered little clarity. The line was open for only a few seconds. Faint voices, indistinct sounds, possibly arguing or the buzz of a holiday gathering, came through. No words of distress were spoken before the call abruptly ended. What the dispatchers could not know was that Joseph McEnroe had smashed the receiver and pulled out the phone's battery, cutting the call short. Though brief, the call raised enough concern for authorities to respond to the listed address. When police arrived at the Anderson property, they encountered a locked gate. The house stood quiet in the distance, lights visible through the trees. There were no screams, no movement, no visible signs of trouble from the outside. It was Christmas Eve, and with no clear evidence of danger, the officers made a judgment call. They turned back without entering the premises. What they did not know was that Michelle Anderson had rushed outside just moments after the 911 call. Realizing that a connection had been made, she quickly locked the gate to prevent any immediate law enforcement intrusion. Her decision was calculated and effective. That single moment, the emergency call that nearly exposed the crime, was lost. A rare window to uncover the unfolding massacre had opened, then just as quickly closed. Had officers looked further, they might have interrupted the killings or arrived in time to apprehend the suspects. Instead, Michelle's quick reaction delayed discovery by 2 full days. The tragedy inside the Anderson home continued, undiscovered and uninterrupted, as if nothing had happened at all. On December 26, 2007, 2 days after the massacre, Judy Anderson's absence from work raised alarm. Her co-worker and close friend, Linda Thiele, grew increasingly concerned. Judy had never missed a shift without notice. With no explanation and no response calls, Linda decided to drive to the Anderson family home to check in. As she arrived at the rural property near Carnation, Washington, the gate remained locked. Linda approached the house, peering through the windows, hoping to catch sight of someone inside. What she saw instead chilled her to the core. There were bodies lying on the ground. Though the details were unclear from the window, she could make out what appeared to be 2 adults. Linda immediately called 911. When she spoke to the dispatcher, she reported that she believed she had seen the bodies of Wayne and Judy Anderson. That was the assumption she made in the moment, based on her relationship with the couple. However, when law enforcement arrived and entered the house, the truth was far more devastating. Inside, officers discovered 6 bodies. The first 2 that Linda had seen through the window were not Wayne and Judy. They were Scott and Erica Anderson. The full extent of the crime slowly came into view. In different areas of the home and on the property, the bodies of Wayne, Judy, Scott, Erica, Olivia, and Nathan Anderson were all found. 3 generations of a single family had been executed in their home. The crime scene was overwhelming. Investigators were met with a mix of horror and disbelief. It was not just a homicide, it was a massacre. The methodical nature of the killings, the inclusion of 2 young children in the rural, quiet setting compounded the shock. News of the discovery quickly spread, shaking the small community of Carnation. Residents, many of whom knew the Andersons personally, struggled to comprehend how such a brutal act had occurred undetected. The idea that a family had been wiped out during the holidays, only to be discovered 2 days later by a concerned friend, added a deeply somber tone to the unfolding case. If not for Linda Thiele's concern and persistence, the crime scene might have remained hidden even longer. Her decision to check on Judy led to the unearthing of one of the most devastating family murders in Washington's recent history. As police continued their investigation at the Anderson residence on December 26, 2007, an unexpected development occurred. Joseph McEnroe and Michelle Anderson returned to property in their vehicle. The timing of their arrival struck investigators as unusual. With 6 bodies discovered and no suspects yet identified, their sudden appearance raised immediate suspicion. Law enforcement officers quickly detained the couple for questioning. There had been no signs of forced entry at the scene. The killings appeared precise and personal, not the result of a random burglary. Given the nature of the crime and their connection to the victims, McEnroe and Anderson were considered persons of interest from the outset. At the station, both suspects displayed an unsettling calm. There was no panic, no apparent fear. When questioned, Michelle and Joseph did not deny their presence at the house. Instead, under pressure and with mounting evidence surrounding them, they began to talk. Their confessions came without much resistance. Michelle Anderson admitted to orchestrating the killings, fueled by long-standing anger toward her family. She spoke of financial grievances, claiming that her brother Scott owed her money. She described years of perceived mistreatment by her parents, Wayne and Judy. Michelle believed she had been pushed aside, neglected, and unfairly treated compared to her brother. Joseph McEnroe supported her version of events. He confirmed his role in the killings, admitting to shooting multiple victims. Both suspects outlined how they planned the attack, how they waited at the house, and how they eliminated each family member as they arrived. The level of detail in their statements left no room for doubt. The confessions ended what had, until then, been a brief and puzzling investigation. With no forced entry, no signs of theft, and no outside threats, the truth became clear. This had been a targeted, internal attack. It was not a robbery gone wrong. It was not an act committed by strangers. This was a calculated family massacre, carried out by two people the victims knew and trusted. The shock deepened as the community realized the killers were not outsiders, but the victim's own daughter and her partner. The sense of betrayal was profound. A tragedy that had already stunned the town took on a new, even darker meaning. With their arrests and full confessions, the focus shifted from finding the killers to understanding how such a devastating plan had taken shape within a single family. Following their confessions to the murders of 6 members of the Anderson family, Joseph McEnroe and Michelle Anderson faced the full weight of the legal system. The brutality of the crime, the number of victims, and the fact that children were among those killed led to significant public attention and a complex legal process. In 2008, not long after her arrest, Michelle Anderson gave an interview in which she expressed a willingness to face the death penalty. She openly stated that she wanted to be executed for her role in the killings. However, the justice system required a thorough examination before such a sentence could even be considered. Mental health professionals were brought in to evaluate her competency to stand trial. Despite her disturbing actions and public statements, she was found mentally competent. The court ruled that she understood the charges against her and was capable of participating in her own defense. Joseph McEnroe also faced the possibility of the death penalty. As the person who carried out many of the fatal shots, including those that killed the children, prosecutors pursued a strong case against him. However, on May 13, 2015, McEnroe was spared the death penalty. Instead, he received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision to forego capital punishment followed years of legal proceedings, appeals, and deliberations. Michelle Anderson's case proceeded separately. On March 4, 2016, she was convicted of 6 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The court found her responsible for each of the killings, and the sentence reflected the magnitude of the crime. Like McEnroe, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The mental competency evaluations played a central role in the legal proceedings, ensuring that both defendants could be held fully accountable under the law. These assessments ensure that justice would proceed not based on emotional responses or public outrage, but within the bounds of due process. The sentencing brought a legal end to one of the most devastating crimes in Washington state's recent history. Though it did not erase the pain or bring back the lives lost, it did deliver a clear and decisive outcome. The court system had heard the facts, reviewed the evidence, and rendered judgment in accordance with the law. Today, Joseph McEnroe is incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary. Michelle Anderson is serving her life sentence at the Washington Corrections Center for Women. Both remain behind bars, separated from society and from a family they destroyed. Their imprisonment serves as a final chapter in a case defined by betrayal, premeditation, and profound loss. The events of December 24, 2007, left a permanent scar on the quiet rural community of Carnation, Washington. Known for its peaceful surroundings and close-knit population, the town was thrust into the national spotlight for a tragedy no one could have foreseen. The deliberate killing of 6 family members inside their own home, carried out by their daughter and her partner. The sheer brutality of the Carnation Massacre deeply affected not just the immediate neighborhood, but people across the country. The fact that the victims ranged from grandparents to young children only magnified the public's sense of shock and disbelief. Communities across Washington mourned the loss, and the town of Carnation struggled to come to terms with the fact that something so horrific had occurred in such an unassuming setting. Those who knew the Anderson family remembered them as ordinary, hard-working individuals. Wayne Scott Anderson, a Boeing engineer, and Judy Anderson, a dedicated postal worker, were known in their community for being reliable and kind. Their son Scott and his wife Erica were both just 32 years old, raising two young children, Olivia, age 5, and Nathan, age 3. Their deaths resonated beyond family and friends, representing a loss of innocence and safety for an entire town. The case drew media attention for its rare and disturbing elements: the familial relationship between victims and perpetrators, the premeditated nature of the attack, and the calculated elimination of potential witnesses, including children. But when the news cycle moved on, Carnation was left with the task of healing. To this day, the Carnation Massacre is remembered not just for the lives it ended, but for the community it changed. 6 lives were lost: Wayne, Judy, Scott, Erica, Olivia, and Nathan, in a crime that offered no justification, only sorrow. The memory of that day continues to serve as a solemn reminder of the fragility of peace and the depths of human betrayal.